Hey everyone, I'd like to thank the association for giving me the opportunity to speak today about system group dynamics and the effect on innovative behavior with orthotists and prosthetists. And you may be thinking to yourself, hey, I think I saw that Stark character talk about this before, but I have new information applied just to orthotists and prosthetists. But before we begin, I wanted to ask you a question. What do you think, what factors affect people in terms of what types of innovation or research that they incorporate in their businesses or clinics? Do you think age has anything to do with it? That younger people are more innovative, older people are less innovative? Or do you think context, if I work for a corporate office, that changes how I choose innovation versus if I work for a single office or even a regional office, or private versus corporate ownership? Or do you think maybe location changes, or we talked about the context, but and experience, but do you think certification, are process more innovative, are technicians more innovative? So those are types of things to ask yourself. So when we talk about innovation, one of the things I have to admit is that in my 29-year career, I've noticed certain groups, certain people, certain locations seem to adopt innovation faster than others. Why is this? Why are certain offices so prone to innovate and others are not? Does the group influence the individual, or does the individual influence the group? Do they just have better leaders, or do they have as a group an understanding about innovation? The question is originally, are people who are early adopters of innovation or innovators, are they more risk tolerant and just less anxious, and this makes them able to accept new innovation? Or is it the opposite way, that innovation helps guide their anxiety? And what are the relationships or connections? So when you look at more differentiated people, let's sort of like Jim from The Office, right? Whatever kind of craziness is happening, he's actually not only looking at it, observing it, but actually kind of enjoys it to a certain extent. But he's really not forced off of his mission. Actually, in the show, his mission is just to hang out, but he's really not changing his mission. But when you look at someone who's less differentiated, that might be like Andy. Andy's so affected by even small things. If you offend Cornell University, he's ready to fight you. So this is the base of the level of differentiation. So Andy would have a low level of differentiation, whereas Jim would have a much higher level of differentiation. So when we look at how groups interact, there's a relationship between different groups. But when there's increased anxiety, so when there's increased arguments or just differences of opinion, when the anxiety is too high, they find another and they start talking about the other with that person. And that's called a triangle. Oftentimes, this other person carries the weight of the anxiety from both of those people, and actually ends up, sometimes even affected by that. That could be it could either be another clinician or it could be the office staff. And when you look at a system of all these triangles, interrelationships or disconnects, or people that don't even talk to each other, you might find certain people become a focus. It might be the assistant office manager gets everyone's stuff, and then they start calling in sick because they physically are sick. They're carrying the emotional weight of all of this anxiety, right? And it actually physically affects them. And when you look at maybe this tangled mess inside of a bigger nested, so there's the individual, there's the unit, there's the company, there's the corporation, it could actually pull the group into an orbit. So we call this an undifferentiated ego mass, all these knots working together. What that means is that people, just like families, are afraid to venture out of their element and find new things to bring to the company because they're worried that no good deed goes unpunished. And if they try to bring something new to the company to help it, they'll be blamed, right? So this is a terrible slide, but this is looking at how group innovation can affect individuals, how group anxiety affects individual differentiation. And there's been some ideas that this sense of dissonance makes it difficult for people to put in new technology, that the group may collectively pressure the person to conform, and that emotion rather than rationality dominate. And sometimes this emotional attachment involves itself with the innovation decision process. So we have this group of innovators, early adopters who look to new things all the time. In fact, in some ways, they could be running away with the profession, like these upper limb specialists, just running away. Whereas the early majority, late majority, they're still trying to figure out how do they cable a transhumeral, where these other groups are looking at, cortex implants, or they're constantly challenging each other. They're looking at osseointegration. This other group's like, well, how do I even make a socket for someone with an upper limb? But it's how individuals jump this chasm. As a younger educator, I used to think I could cleave off whole sections and pull them over. But now I'm realizing it's individuals I look for that can make the jump to be an early adopter of technology. So the innovators can be even hillbillies, right? They have their picnic table boat. Hey, that's good, on a pontoon. These are venturesome, but they're kind of rash and they're kind of daring. They're always the first to try something new, but they almost make you a little nervous, right? Because of what they do. There's only 2 out of 100, maybe 2.5%. But these guys are a little bit crazy, a little bit rash. They're the ones that try something new all the time. 13.5% are opinion leaders. They actually look at the innovator, look for what kind of mistakes they make, but then decide, okay, this is a good idea. In the old days, this was people who sold actually seed corn hybrid, right? This is where this whole idea comes from. The early majority waited for this 2 group to show whether or not it worked or not, and then they jumped in. Early majority might be fitting sea legs by now, but the late majority only fits a few of them. And then the laggards are the people that are still fitting a mouth unit, because there's no reason to plug in a prosthetic knee. They're the ones that actually, in some ways, are innovators in how they reject things, but they're very risk adverse, and they really don't have a very high confidence or security with technology. So when we look at the speed of adoption, we look at 5 things actually. Relative advantage: is it doing what it should? Is it compatible with how we work? How complex is it? Can I integrate this? Can I try it out, and can I observe it? Those of you who are true innovators, and it doesn't have to be O&P, it could be in any part of your life. It could be how you shop for food. You only need to hear about it. So what's the advantage? Is it compatible? And how complex is it? So like if you get your food delivered, you might pay a little bit more, but you look at this advantage in time. Or you may look at something as simple as going to a new type of office management software. You don't necessarily need to try it and observe it, but if you are more risk adverse, if you're nervous about this new office management software, you want to try it for a month. We see the same types of adoption in terms of groups with locusts. Locusts aren't necessarily looking for food. The first ones are, but they're also afraid of the locusts behind them that want to eat them, and so on down the line. So we look at this in terms of movement, in terms of flocks of birds or mathematical models. And surprisingly, there's a role to play with people that can't choose one or the other. They actually follow whichever leader they think gives them the greatest economic benefit, even when they're not even conscious of it. So when we look at this technology or diffusion within healthcare, we look at this process and the practitioner may actually influence whether or not the patient chooses to adopt something, because the practitioner in a sense is providing the leadership, and anxious groups may not negotiate this uncertainty very well. So way back when, in 2016, pre-COVID, I looked at, does anxiety influence the ability to adopt readiness, and what is the influence of gender, experience, inter-office linkages and office affiliations? And so the workplace differentiation looks at how reactive you are, how prone to argument, how prone you are to cut someone off and say, I don't want to talk to you anymore. And also your tendency to fuse with others. I'll do it if he's going to do it, but not until then I see that. And I looked at technology readiness in terms of optimism, innovativeness, how comfortable you are with technology, and how secure you are. Optimism is like, I think technology is a good thing. How much you see that. Innovativeness is, am I ready to implement it? Discomfort is, does technology make me feel a little worried? And then insecurity means, I think technology is a threat. So I took those 2 groups and I actually posted a survey, had 230 respondents over 16 days with 23 comments. The demographics, I had predominantly male, 22% female. One of the larger groups represented were the groups in terms of experience over 31 years. So it might be somewhat skewed. And then in terms of office affiliation, mostly were private. The 32% that were corporate might be underrepresented, as well as the hospital and rehab centers. And then most of them have been CPOs or CPs, but we're seeing that change demographically to 2/3 now are CPOs, and maybe slightly more, maybe 25% are CPs, and then COs even fewer. And then in terms of self-assessment, most consider themselves experts, which is kind of the halo bias. So the first question, were there one or more relationships between individual emotional anxiety and technology? Meaning, if I'm more anxious, am I more open to receiving technology? And what I found was, I thought anxiety affected technology. But what I found when I looked at what's causal, I found that actually technology influences anxiety. So in this case, I did find a 0.583. In terms of biomechanics, this would be very low, but in behavioralism, anything more than 0.45 or so shows at least a pretty high level of correlation. And then when I looked at correlation between the component parts, meaning optimism, innovativeness with reactivity and cutoff, I also saw correlations. The second question was, there one or more aspects of the WDI that can serve as predictive models of technology readiness? So when I looked at this, I actually saw much lower. I found that anxiety only moderately affects technology readiness. I was a little disappointed, frankly, and I thought I wasn't going to get my PhD. But by a serendipitous outcome, when I flip-flopped those, I found that technology had a much higher effect on anxiety. So that was the next question. Are there one or more aspects of the technology readiness scale that can be predictive of models of anxiety? And what I found was a much higher level. So what I found was, what that means is that if groups are less anxious, they may or may not be more innovative. At least they get along better. But if groups are more innovative, their anxiety level definitely changes. It lowers. And so we saw this. So are there any differences based on the demographic attributes? What I found was, yeah, I found there wasn't a lot of anything here, actually. Males and females were equally strong in terms of innovation. Males and females were equally the same in terms of all the different attributes of optimism, innovation, discomfort, and anxiety. In terms of WDI, females were a little bit able to deal with anxiety a little bit higher. Just they deal within that realm a little bit more, but it wasn't very significant. And when you looked at the component attributes, only slightly higher for females, but not worth reporting. Office affiliation did have a slightly lower level, only very so slightly lower level of anxiety. So key finding, there was a strong predictive relationship of emotional reactivity and emotional cutoff on optimism. So meaning that if you're more reactive, argumentative, or prone to just tell someone, I'm not going to deal with you, it did affect how optimistic you were in general. But was that toward technology or just all of life? The next one was very strong predictive relationship of technology, optimism, and innovation on workplace differentiation. What that means is, if your boss was challenging you with more things to do, more innovations consistently, you just get used to the anxiety of innovation better. It's not that you don't argue, it's that you just argue better. It's that you deal with that inherent dissonance of innovation much better. So leaders should actually encourage that. Another key finding, there's a strong predictive relationship between technology optimism, technology innovation in particular, on emotional reactivity. So the outlook, the context toward technology, are your ability to implement it, your emotional reactivity overall decreases. So the key findings, there were no significant relationships between technology readiness on gender certification. So age has nothing to do with how innovative you are. Where you work has nothing to do with it. What your gender is, what your office affiliation. what your technology is self-assessment. You could say you're a specialist and still be nervous. It doesn't matter. Your office affiliation had no bearing on your technology readiness. And those that identified themselves as experts or specialists were no more technologically ready. So actually your self-assessment is suspect. But there was some relationship between WDI scores or anxiety scores and years of experience and affiliation, meaning you've had a more, if you had a more technologically forward group, or at least one that you can relate to, you were able to deal with anxiety better. The limitations, of course, we had a kind of a pro-innovation bias. It might call into question some of the self-assessments. We also had more older test takers. Well, this has always bothered me. And in 2021, which is now, I wanted to remeasure this. I wanted to know, does the TRI, I couldn't change it for my dissertation, but I could for just doing a survey, does this alter, would it alter the respondents? So we had 201 respondents over 14 days with 100% completion of 65 comments. So was readiness based on experience, context, or certification? And has this changed since 2016? And when I looked at by CPO, process only slightly higher, but not significantly. Process orthotist at the lowest level, but not significantly. When I looked at location, multi-center or private offices were the lowest, but not significantly. There was just a lot of nothing happening here. Those by experience, what we find is those with 11 to 15, 16 to 20 years have the lowest levels of readiness. And it could be that they know whether or not technology works or not. 0 to 5 was actually surprisingly low, while 26 years or more was the highest. When I looked at by the components of technology readiness, the CPO implementation was the lowest. So this was something to look at. And then when I looked at by context, technology security is the highest among research centers, which we would expect, but lowest among regional, multi-center, private owned offices. And then technology implementation for experience was the lowest for 0 to 5. I mean, they just don't feel confident yet with the new technology, but then highest for those over 26 years. They know that there are groups ready to help them. Now, again, this is a terrible slide, but this shows you where the highest levels of correlation were, and that I can actually dial in and look at those things. So what I did was I counted those areas that they rated 4 or 5 in terms of their confidence with technology. The things that gave them the greatest confidence were quality of life measures, enhancements to patient life, so patient process relationship, and how confident they are that they're getting good resources. This tells you where research could be directed and people understand what that's coming from. It was lowest for putting things into increasing production, being the first to use and the first to figure out. That's where they have the lowest levels of technology readiness, where they worry the most. And that's where they're looking for help more often than not. So in their busy clinic lives, where can they get this help? So the key findings for this latest study was O&P practitioners actually have a high technology readiness. So certification, context, experience, and age have no correlation, but they feel very confident that it can improve, technology can improve quality of life, mobility, and the patient process relationship. However, they feel the least confident with areas of implementation. Are they the first to figure things out? They're looking for product champions or people at manufacturers that can help them. Also, they feel a little bit more apprehensive to figure out things on their own. So the greatest risk and anxiety is this external value of technology and support. This has very little to do with the actual technology itself. And when I say external value, how's that measured? Well, it's measured with outcomes. So this focus on quality of life, increased mobility, and the patient's perception or the payer's perception of value is most important. Well, to be honest with you, that's very humbling, because it tells me as an engineer, I can design things, people will understand it. That's not something they worry about, but really what they worry about is things that are the greatest valuation. So when we ask the big 5 questions that transform our lives, You know, we could ask ourselves, what is our business? Well, we could say providing orthotic and prosthetic care. It's kind of that. But what we're really trying to do is we should be demonstrating the value of what we provide to the patient's overall lifestyle. I know that people do this, by the way, but it's not about the component, it's about the patient. And then what is the market structure? When we say that, who owns the information? Well, the information is primarily owned by the payers. They know more about who our customers are and what the aggregate costs are. Now we're getting our act together with the registry by Dr. Ken Kaufman, where we're going to be able to understand the aggregate successes based on components, but we're only just starting. And so then who is our customer? Or you could say the customer is the patient. I wish I could say that that's true, but it's actually the third-party payer. So when we know that the customer is really the third-party payer, how do we use what we know about technology to demonstrate that? And then what are your resources and deficiencies? What are things that we feel confident about in O&P? We feel pretty confident about technology. We feel deficient in how we show that valuation to others, how we demonstrate that. And these are the real pathways to transformation. All right. Hey, I hope that that was fun. I hope that that gave you some things to think about. It gave me a lot to think about because as an engineer, I realized my whole life designing new and better things, it's good, but maybe I'm missing the boat. Maybe the real thing is demonstrating this value and looking for that as a consumer of research. Here are my references. Some of them have to do with organizational perception of innovation, and some of them have to do with anxiety and technology readiness. Parasuurman is a great one. Rogers, Shine, if I could recommend these books. Again, my name is Gerry Stark. My personal email, gerald.e.stark@gmail.com. And I'm always happy to answer the questions you have. I thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great rest of the meeting.